Almina's childhood was never as simple as her later titles would suggest. To the world of polite society, she was introduced as a fortunate young woman with a wealthy guardian, carefully groomed for a promising future. But the truth of her beginnings was far more complicated, and those complications would shape every part of her destiny. She was born in 1876 to Marie Wombwell, a woman already marked by whispers of scandal, and whose social connections were fragile at best. Yet the name most often tied to Almina's origins was not her mother's husband, but Alfred de Rothschild, the immensely wealthy banker whose fortune and influence stretched across Europe. Alfred was a man of immense power, a member of one of the richest families in the world, but his personal life was as secretive as his banking ledgers. He never married, and he fathered no legitimate children. For that reason, many have long believed that Almina was his daughter, the product of a liaison hidden from polite conversation but whispered about in private drawing rooms. He never publicly acknowledged her as his child, yet his generosity toward her left little doubt about the truth. From her earliest years, Alfred provided for Almina with a level of comfort that her official family could never have afforded. He gave her not just money, but an entry ticket into a society that would have otherwise rejected her for her questionable parentage. It is important to remember the times in which she lived. In Edwardian and late Victorian society, illegitimacy was a stain that could never be erased. Children born out of wedlock were often ostracized, denied access to privilege, and forever regarded as outsiders. A girl like Almina, without Alfred's influence, would have been invisible in the grand halls of aristocracy. Instead, she was lifted up, educated, and prepared for a life far above the circumstances of her birth. But that privilege came at a price. The constant knowledge that her position depended not on her name, but on the money and power of a man who could never publicly call her his own. For young Almina, childhood was therefore a strange mix of advantage and shadow. She had the silks, the jewels, and the tutors that most girls could only dream of. But she also had the lingering awareness that she was different. Society could sense it, even when it wasn't spoken aloud. Whispers followed her into ballrooms. Hostesses made subtle remarks. She was tolerated because Alfred de Rothschild's fortune was impossible to ignore. Yet tolerance is not acceptance. Almina's early life was marked by both privilege and insecurity, a duality that would define her adult choices. As she grew older, Alfred's intentions became clear. He was determined to secure her place in the highest levels of society, not as a mere guest, but as a member. He understood the rules of aristocracy better than anyone. Money could buy entry, but it had to be presented in the right way. For Almina, that meant marriage. Not just any marriage, but a marriage into one of the grand families of England. Alfred's fortune could serve as her dowry, and his influence could open the doors. With the right union, Almina could transform from a whispered-about illegitimate child into a countess with power and respect. This was not unusual for the time. Across Britain, marriages between wealthy heiresses and titled men were transactional arrangements disguised as romance. Aristocrats with ancient names but dwindling finances eagerly sought brides with money, while wealthy families with no noble lineage sought titles for their daughters. It was a game of survival and ambition, and Almina's future was secured by it. She may not have had a spotless name, but she had something far more powerful: Alfred's endless wealth. Yet even as plans for her future were being laid, Almina herself was shaped by her peculiar position. She learned early that money could buy respect, that appearances mattered more than truth, and that secrets were often the currency of survival. She also learned that charm, wit, and beauty could make people forget what they whispered behind her back. These lessons would guide her later life, as she navigated not only her marriage, but also the scandals that followed her. When the time came, Alfred de Rothschild arranged for Almina to marry George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. It was a match that stunned many in society. An illegitimate heiress wedded to a man whose family traced its lineage through centuries of English nobility. To some it was a scandal, to others it was proof of Alfred's power. But above all, it was the union that cemented Almina's place in history. She would not just be a wealthy outsider, she would become Lady Carnarvon of Highclere Castle. It is here that Almina's story truly begins to take shape. Her childhood had been one of shadows and whispers, but her marriage thrust her into the center of society. She entered the grand world of Highclere not as a guest but as its mistress. Yet the same contradictions that marked her early life, privilege and scandal, admiration and suspicion, would follow her into marriage. The girl who grew up knowing she was different was now a woman who would carry her secrets into a castle that was itself filled with secrets. The marriage of Almina Wombwell to George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, was celebrated as a grand triumph of status and wealth. To the casual eye, it looked like a perfect union. A young woman suddenly elevated into one of the most prestigious families in England, and a nobleman whose declining finances were rescued by the fortune she carried with her. In truth, it was a calculated bargain, a transaction that suited both sides while leaving the question of affection and compatibility unanswered. Highclere Castle, the sprawling estate that would later be immortalized as the setting of Downton Abbey, became Almina's new home. Its towers and gardens reflected centuries of aristocratic pride. Guests marveled at the scale of the estate, the endless rooms, the manicured lawns, and the paintings that lined the corridors. For Almina, stepping into Highclere meant stepping into history itself. She had gone from whispered illegitimacy to the grand halls of nobility in a single ceremony. But what the marriage contract secured in status, it failed to provide in intimacy. George Herbert was a man marked by both privilege and burden. He loved the freedoms that his wealth afforded him, particularly the thrill of motor cars and the excitement of expeditions. Yet he was also a man of ill health and fragile temperament. The union between Almina and George was less about love than it was about survival. He needed her money. She needed his title. The arrangement was common in aristocratic circles, but for Almina, who had grown up with the constant sting of whispers about her birth, the match was more than a title. It was her entry into a world that had always seemed just out of reach. From the outside, the Countess of Carnarvon appeared to embrace her new role with grace. She presided over lavish dinners, entertained guests from across the country, and hosted glittering events that rivaled those of any noble house in England. Her beauty and wit charmed many, and her wealth made her indispensable. In public, she was a success. Yet behind the locked doors of Highclere, the cracks in her marriage became increasingly clear. George Herbert was not a faithful husband, nor was he an affectionate one. His interests often pulled him away from Almina, leaving her to manage the duties of the estate alone. The age-old reality of aristocratic marriages surfaced quickly. Husbands and wives lived parallel lives, bound together in name but separate in affection. For Almina, who had been thrust into a world built on appearances, the absence of emotional closeness left a void. That void would become the fertile ground for rumors of affairs, of liaisons hidden behind the grandeur of Highclere's walls. But even before those whispers began, Almina had to learn the difficult balance of power in her marriage. Though George held the title of Earl, it was her dowry that kept the estate afloat. Her fortune paid the debts, maintained the castle, and funded the lifestyle that kept the Herbert name in high regard. This imbalance created its own strain. A woman who was meant to be submissive in the eyes of society became the true financial backbone of her husband's world. It was a quiet power, but power nonetheless. Highclere Castle itself reflected this duality. Its halls echoed with grandeur, but its walls held secrets. Visitors came and went, marveling at the splendor, never knowing what tensions lingered between its lord and lady. Servants whispered in corridors, hearing more than they ever revealed. And society, ever eager for scandal, watched closely, waiting for cracks to widen into fractures. Still, Almina adapted. She understood that survival in this world meant playing her role flawlessly. She smiled at the right moments, entertained with charm, and hid her frustrations behind glittering gowns and dazzling jewels. Yet beneath the performance she yearned for something more, something that her marriage could not give her. And in that yearning, she began to step further into dangerous territory, where whispers of scandal could no longer be silenced. The marriage of wealth and title had given her power and protection, but it had not given her fulfillment. George's frequent absences, his indulgences, and his disregard for her emotional needs opened a door to temptation. For a woman as vibrant and passionate as Almina, the coldness of her marriage made the allure of forbidden relationships even stronger. She had the charm, the beauty, and the influence to attract admirers, and society's whispers suggest that she did not resist them for long. Her story was becoming one of contradictions, a countess adored in public but restless in private, a wife bound by duty but tempted by desire. The very foundations of her marriage, wealth and convenience, were unable to protect her from the inevitability of scandal. The facade of Highclere's perfection was beginning to crack, and the cracks led straight into the world of affairs, secrets, and betrayals. What began as whispers in hushed corners of ballrooms would soon become stories too persistent to ignore. Behind the grandeur of Highclere Castle, Lady Almina Carnarvon was stepping into the dangerous world of hidden lovers and secret liaisons. It was a world that promised excitement, but also carried risks that could destroy her reputation, her marriage, and perhaps even her life. Behind the towering walls of Highclere Castle, where chandeliers sparkled and polished silver gleamed under candlelight, another reality pulsed quietly in the shadows. Lady Almina Carnarvon, already marked by a marriage built more on necessity than affection, soon found herself pulled into the magnetic world of passion and secrecy. The public image of a dutiful countess and hostess never faltered. Her poise was flawless, her charm captivating. But in private, the cracks of dissatisfaction widened into paths of temptation. George Herbert, her husband, was often absent both physically and emotionally. His health was fragile, his temper unpredictable, and his indulgences left little room for intimacy. To society, the Earl and Countess presented a picture of respectability, but behind closed doors, they lived like strangers. For Almina, who had been raised in privilege but also in insecurity, the lack of affection was more than loneliness. It was a void that demanded to be filled. And in Edwardian England, where appearances mattered above all else, filling that void meant stepping into a dangerous game of discretion. Rumors began quietly. Servants noticed unfamiliar men lingering longer than usual after visits. Friends of the family gossiped about stolen glances at dinners and the warmth of her smiles directed at certain guests. Aristocratic circles were tight-knit, and secrets rarely remained hidden for long. Yet affairs among the upper classes were far from uncommon. Husbands strayed openly, and wives, expected to endure, sometimes found their own ways of rebellion. Still, for a woman like Almina, already shadowed by whispers of illegitimacy, the risks were greater. Any scandal attached to her name could undo the fragile respect her marriage had secured. Yet Almina possessed a charm that was difficult to resist. Her beauty was delicate but striking. Her eyes carried a spark that drew attention. Her voice was laced with wit and intelligence. Admirers gravitated toward her and she toward them. Some accounts suggest that her relationships were more than just passing flirtations. They were entanglements that fed both her desire for affection and her need for validation. The Countess, who had grown up aware of her questionable origins, was now proving that she could command attention not only through money and title, but through desire itself. These affairs, however, were not without consequences. In Edwardian high society, gossip was currency. A single rumor repeated enough times could damage a reputation beyond repair. Almina's position as Countess offered her a shield, but not immunity. For every admirer enchanted by her presence, there was a rival ready to whisper about her indiscretions. Scandal always lurked just beyond the door, waiting to strike. And scandals, particularly those involving women, were treated with merciless judgment. Men could indulge their affairs with little consequence. Women risked social exile. For Almina, the stakes were high. Every secret meeting, every whispered rendezvous carried with it the possibility of exposure. Yet the risk did not deter her. If anything, it seemed to embolden her. Perhaps she believed her wealth and position would protect her. Perhaps the loneliness of her marriage drove her beyond caution. Whatever the reason, she stepped deeper into the world of forbidden relationships, creating a double life that few could ignore. There were whispers of affairs with men of influence, men whose names were too powerful to be spoken aloud in accusation. These connections gave her both pleasure and leverage, but they also tied her to a web of secrecy that could unravel at any moment. To some, she was admired for her boldness. To others, she was condemned as reckless. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in the shadows between admiration and scandal. But affairs carried dangers beyond gossip. In a time when contraception was unreliable and scandal could be fueled by even the hint of impropriety, the consequences of indiscretion could be devastating. Pregnancies, whispered rumors of desperate measures, and the looming specter of abortion haunted not just Almina, but many women of her class. The very act of seeking passion outside her marriage carried with it the possibility of a downfall far greater than gossip. This duality, angel in public, sinner in private, only grew sharper as her life progressed. In the ballroom, she was the elegant countess who charmed dukes and duchesses. In private, she was a woman pursuing the affection and validation her marriage could not provide. This contradiction would define her legacy. She was both admired and feared, both envied and pitied, and as the whispers of affairs grew louder, they became the prelude to even darker accusations that would follow her for years to come. For behind the laughter of her dinner parties and the applause of her charitable works lay a secret even more dangerous than her affairs. It was a secret that carried the weight of illegality, of moral outrage, and of whispered horror. It was a secret tied to the desperate measures women of her time sometimes took to hide the evidence of their indiscretions. A secret that would forever taint Almina's story with shadows darker than mere infidelity. The affairs were only the beginning. They set the stage for a scandal that would reach far beyond whispers of passion. For the name of Lady Almina Carnarvon would soon be tied not only to lovers and betrayals, but to the whispered world of illegal abortions, a world of danger, secrecy and consequences that few dared to speak of aloud. The whispers that had long followed Lady Almina Carnarvon, her rumoured affairs, her fleeting romances, her hunger for passion, were dangerous enough. But they paled in comparison to the darkest shadows that began to cling to her reputation. For hidden beneath the sparkle of her jewels and the grandeur of Highclere Castle was a secret that Victorian and Edwardian England regarded as unforgivable: the silent world of abortion. In Edwardian society, abortions were not merely frowned upon, they were criminal, condemned both by law and by the moral code of the day. To even speak of them aloud was to court scandal. And yet, they existed, tucked away in whispers, in secret clinics, in hurried visits to discreet midwives, and in the back rooms of London's underworld. Women of all classes, from servants to society ladies, sought them in desperation. Some were already mothers, unable to face another child. Others, unmarried, feared the ruin of illegitimacy. And some, like Almina, may have sought them to conceal the results of forbidden passion. Almina's name became tied to this hidden world not through open confession, but through rumor, speculation, and the relentless appetite of the aristocracy for gossip. Servants whispered about unexplained absences. Friends raised eyebrows at sudden illnesses followed by miraculous recoveries. Doctors were said to have visited in the night, leaving just as quickly, their bags heavy with both medicine and silence. The rumors grew louder that Lady Almina had sought abortions, not once but more than once, to erase the evidence of affairs she could not allow the world to see. Whether or not the stories were true, they stuck. In a society that fed on scandal, the accusation was enough to stain her reputation forever. For every admirer who praised her beauty and charm, there was a detractor ready to call her immoral, reckless, and dangerous. But to understand why these rumors carried such weight, one must understand the context of her world. Edwardian England was obsessed with appearances. A woman's value was tied to her purity, her obedience, her ability to preserve her family's name. An illegitimate child would have been catastrophic for Almina, not only for her marriage to George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, but for her very standing in society. She had clawed her way upward from whispers of illegitimacy herself, the daughter of Alfred de Rothschild, but born outside wedlock. To repeat that shame would have been unbearable, and so, the darker rumors took hold that she had turned to abortion as a desperate form of control, a way to protect the life she had built, no matter the cost. Abortions in those days were not the medical procedures of today. They were dangerous, often deadly. Women risked infection, mutilation, and even death in back rooms and hidden clinics. Those who could afford it, like Almina, might find discreet doctors willing to risk their licenses for a price. But even in the hands of professionals, the procedures were perilous. Many women never recovered fully, carrying scars both physical and emotional for the rest of their lives. If Almina truly underwent such ordeals, she must have lived in constant fear of exposure, fear of the physical consequences, fear of the whispers turning into accusations. And yet, the rumors suggest that she may have returned to this path more than once, each time walking the razor's edge between secrecy and destruction. The irony was cruel. To the public, Lady Almina styled herself as a patroness of health. She opened parts of Highclere Castle as a hospital during the First World War, tending to the wounded with a sense of duty and compassion. Patients and doctors alike praised her dedication, and yet, behind this image of healing, there may have been a hidden truth. A woman who had herself risked her body in clandestine procedures, not for the sake of life, but to erase evidence of passion. For her critics, the contradiction was damning. How could a woman who publicly served as a healer privately engage in something they considered murderous? For her defenders, the rumors were nothing more than malicious gossip, fueled by envy and the double standards of her time. After all, men of her class carried on countless affairs without consequence. Why should a woman's desperation for control be condemned more harshly? Yet history rarely deals in fairness. The whispers of abortion clung to Almina like smoke, darkening her legacy no matter how much she dazzled in the ballroom or triumphed in the hospital wards. To some, she was a modern woman ahead of her time, unafraid to take control of her own body and destiny. To others, she was a reckless countess who crossed every boundary of morality. But perhaps the truth lies not in the extremes, but in the humanity of her choices. Almina was a woman caught in a gilded cage, bound by marriage, trapped by societal expectations, and yet desperate for affection, passion, and freedom. In that desperation, she may have turned to measures that her society deemed unspeakable. The great tragedy was that such rumors never truly faded. Even decades later, as historians and biographers explored her life, the whispers of abortion shadowed every discussion of her affairs. They added a layer of darkness to her story, transforming her from a glamorous hostess into a woman forever linked to scandal. And those whispers lead us deeper still, because Almina's life was not only marked by illicit passion and dangerous secrets. Beyond the affairs and the abortions lay another defining thread: her role as a benefactor during one of the bloodiest conflicts in history. The outbreak of the First World War would drag Almina from the world of whispered scandal into the harsh, undeniable reality of war. And in that crucible of suffering, she would attempt to rewrite her legacy, not as a scandalous countess, but as a savior of men. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 shattered the illusions of Edwardian splendor. The world of aristocratic parties, glittering gowns, and whispered scandals suddenly seemed trivial when Europe descended into chaos. For Lady Almina Carnarvon, the war was not just a turning point in history, it was a turning point in her own life. The scandalous countess, whispered about for her affairs and dark secrets, stepped into a new role, one that seemed almost impossible given her reputation. She became the savior of men, the angel of Highclere Castle. When war was declared, Almina understood something very few in her circle did: that the bloodshed would not remain confined to foreign fields. The wounded would flood back to England, and hospitals would be overwhelmed. In a bold and unprecedented move, she transformed her own home, Highclere Castle, into a fully functional hospital for soldiers. The same halls that had once echoed with aristocratic laughter were now filled with stretchers, bandages, and the moans of men torn apart by modern warfare. Her decision stunned high society. Many aristocrats offered token gestures to the war effort, donations, charity events, or patriotic speeches. But Almina went further. She poured her personal fortune into equipping Highclere with the latest medical technology. Operating tables gleamed beneath chandeliers. Wards were set up in grand drawing rooms. Doctors and nurses worked under portraits of ancestors who had once presided over the empire. The grandeur of the castle became a backdrop for suffering, sacrifice, and, in some cases, miraculous survival. And at the center of it all was Almina herself. Dressed not in ball gowns but in crisp white uniforms, she patrolled the wards with a commanding presence. She sat beside soldiers who wept in pain, held the hands of men gasping their last breaths, and listened to the confessions of young boys who feared they would never see home again. To these men, she was not the scandalous Countess of gossip columns. She was their nurse, their comforter, their angel. Newspapers praised her efforts. Photographs of the Countess of Highclere smiling beside wounded men were printed as symbols of aristocratic duty. Suddenly, her name was associated not with affairs or whispers of abortion, but with sacrifice and compassion. It was in many ways a carefully crafted image. Yet it was also real. For all her flaws, Almina did devote herself to the hospital. She spent countless nights walking the halls, checking on patients, ensuring the doctors had whatever they needed. Her fortune dwindled, but her reputation soared. There was a bitter irony in this transformation. The very woman whispered to have destroyed life in secret was now saving it in public. Her hospital became one of the most respected private facilities of the war, attracting doctors who wanted to work with her, soldiers who longed to be sent there, and dignitaries who marveled at the efficiency of her operation. Even King George V and Queen Mary were said to admire her efforts. For once, Lady Almina seemed untouchable, not as a scandal but as a heroine. And yet, beneath the surface, contradictions remained. Some society insiders scoffed that her hospital was less about compassion and more about image. They pointed to the lavish details, the fine linens, the extravagant meals provided to doctors, the ornate settings of the wards, and suggested that Almina was less interested in medicine than in being admired. Others whispered that her close contact with soldiers was not always as innocent as it appeared, fueling further rumors of affairs amidst the wards of Highclere. But whether her motives were pure or complex, the fact remained hundreds of men lived because of her. Soldiers who would otherwise have died in overcrowded military hospitals found healing within the castle walls. And for those who could not be saved, Almina's presence offered dignity in death. Many letters written home by soldiers spoke not of pain, but of the kind lady who sat by my bed. It was during these years that Almina's double life reached its peak. By day, she was the Florence Nightingale of Highclere. By night, the same whispers of scandal continued to swirl. Rumors of affairs with doctors, with officers, even with staff members persisted. But in wartime, such gossip carried less weight. Britain needed heroes, and Almina fit the part, at least on the surface. As the war dragged on, the hospital drained her resources. Her fortune, vast though it had been, was not infinite. Maintaining Highclere as a medical facility cost thousands upon thousands of pounds. She sold jewels, land, and treasures to keep it running. By the end of the war, Almina had not only spent much of her inheritance, but had also placed herself in precarious financial circumstances. Still, she persisted, as if proving that she could be more than the woman society had condemned her to be. And so, when the war finally ended in 1918, Lady Almina emerged not as a ruined countess, but as a paradox. She was both heroine and scandal, both savior and sinner. To the soldiers she saved, she was unforgettable. To society, she was still an enigma, but peace brought new problems. The war had changed everything, not least the fortunes of the aristocracy. The gilded life that had once sustained Almina began to crumble. And with the return of ordinary life came the return of scrutiny, scandal, and financial ruin. Her husband, Lord Carnarvon, would soon embark on a journey that would make history and bring tragedy with it. The guns of the Great War had barely fallen silent when Lord George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, turned his restless energy toward a passion that had consumed him for years: Egypt. To the world, he was the wealthy aristocrat whose money had helped his wife transform Highclere Castle into a hospital during the war. But beneath the polished exterior, Carnarvon harbored a fascination that bordered on obsession. The mysteries of the ancient world buried beneath the sands of the Valley of the Kings. It began innocently enough. Like many aristocrats of his age, he had traveled to Egypt to escape the dreariness of English winters. The warm air soothed his health, which had been fragile since a serious car accident years earlier. But soon, the sunlit land offered more than convalescence. He became enthralled with the relics, the temples, the hieroglyphs. Egypt was exotic, timeless, and intoxicating, and it was filled with secrets waiting to be unearthed. By the early 1900s, Carnarvon was no longer a mere tourist. He had become a dedicated patron of archaeology, pouring vast sums of his wife's Rothschild fortune into expeditions. He partnered with a relatively unknown archaeologist, Howard Carter, a man of humble origins but unyielding determination. Together they scoured the desert for tombs that had lain untouched for millennia. For Almina, these expeditions were both a relief and a worry. They kept her husband occupied and far from the gossip-filled drawing rooms of London. Yet they also drained the very fortune she had brought into the marriage. While she busied herself with her hospital and her affairs, Carnarvon was spending late nights under desert skies, dreaming of golden glory. By 1922, years of searching had brought little more than fragments. Many of Carnarvon's peers mocked him for wasting his fortune chasing ghosts. Even he began to doubt the worth of his endeavors. But Carter remained steadfast, convinced that one final undiscovered treasure lay buried, the tomb of the boy king Tutankhamun. That November, Carter's persistence paid off. Deep in the Valley of the Kings, his workers uncovered the first steps leading to a sealed doorway. Behind it lay something extraordinary. When Carter sent word to Carnarvon in England, the Earl wasted no time. Despite his fragile health, he traveled at once to Egypt to witness what would become the most sensational archaeological discovery of the century. On November 26, 1922, Carnarvon stood beside Carter as they broke through the sealed entrance. Carter held a candle, peering into the darkness. When asked if he could see anything, Carter famously replied, "Yes, wonderful things." Inside lay treasures beyond imagination, statues, jewelry, furniture, and deeper still, the undisturbed sarcophagus of Tutankhamun himself. The world erupted in fascination. Newspapers around the globe chronicled every step of the discovery. For a moment, Carnarvon, once dismissed as a wealthy dilettante, was hailed as the man who had funded the greatest find in modern history. Highclere Castle, so long associated with scandal, now basked in reflected glory. But triumph was short-lived. Just months after the discovery, tragedy struck. In March 1923, while staying at the Continental Savoy Hotel in Cairo, Carnarvon was bitten on the cheek by a mosquito. The wound became infected, and when he accidentally nicked it while shaving, the infection spread rapidly. In an era before antibiotics, such an infection was often fatal. His health deteriorated quickly. On April 5, 1923, George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, died in Cairo. He was just 56 years old. The shock was immediate, but what followed turned his death into legend. Within hours, newspapers began whispering of a curse. Had the tomb of Tutankhamun, sealed for thousands of years, unleashed vengeance upon those who disturbed it? Reporters pointed to eerie coincidences. At the very hour of Carnarvon's death, it was said that all the lights in Cairo mysteriously went out. Back at Highclere Castle, his beloved dog Susie reportedly let out a howl and dropped dead. Other members of the excavation team soon suffered misfortunes of their own, fueling the tale of a pharaoh's curse. The idea of a supernatural punishment captured the public imagination. The story of the mummy's curse spread like wildfire, blending fact, myth, and hysteria. Though scientists dismissed the notion, the legend stuck, forever linking Carnarvon's name not only to discovery, but to death. For Almina, the tragedy was devastating. Whatever distance had grown between them over the years, Carnarvon's death left her widowed, vulnerable, and financially unstable. Much of the fortune she had poured into his ventures was gone, and the glamorous life she had built began to crumble. Yet even as she grieved, she had to contend with the sensational headlines. Her husband was remembered not simply as an earl or an archaeologist, but as the victim of a curse. The irony was sharp. Almina, so long dogged by whispers of scandal, now found herself overshadowed by a legend that had nothing to do with her own indiscretions. Her story and her husband's had become entwined in the myth of Tutankhamun's tomb. In the years that followed, scholars and historians would argue endlessly about whether Carnarvon's death was coincidence, infection, or curse. But in the public imagination, the matter was settled. The Earl of Carnarvon had dared disturb the eternal rest of a pharaoh, and he had paid the ultimate price, and with his death, Almina's life entered its final and most desperate phase. The wealth that had sustained her began to evaporate. Debts mounted, scandals resurfaced. The heroine of Highclere Hospital and the widow of the cursed Earl was about to descend into ruin. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb had made Lord Carnarvon's name immortal, but for Lady Almina, his widow, it marked the beginning of a long and painful decline. The euphoria of the find was quickly overshadowed by grief, scandal, and above all, the crushing weight of financial ruin. Behind the gilded doors of Highclere Castle, the woman once hailed as both savior and scandalous Countess now faced a stark reality. The fortune that had built her life of glamour was gone, and the aristocratic world that had once embraced her turned its back with merciless speed. When George Herbert died in Cairo in 1923, much of the Rothschild fortune Almina had brought into the marriage was already spent. Her husband's passion for archaeology had drained vast sums. The war years with the hospital she had run at Highclere had consumed even more. And though she had once been seen as a woman of almost endless wealth, the truth was far more precarious. Without her husband's title to shield her, creditors descended, bills mounted, debts were called in. The financial empire she had inherited and expanded was crumbling brick by brick. Worse still, legal battles began to erupt around her. Disputes over inheritance, over property, over money owed. It seemed every corner of her world was filled with someone demanding payment she could no longer afford. The woman who had once dazzled London society now found herself the subject of courtroom dramas and scandal sheets. To survive, Almina turned to desperate measures. She began selling off treasures from Highclere Castle, paintings, jewels, heirlooms that had once belonged to the great Carnarvon dynasty. Auction houses buzzed as priceless pieces of history were dispersed to the highest bidder. Each sale was a public humiliation, proof that the once gilded Countess was falling apart. But the sales were not enough. Her debts outpaced her assets and creditors were relentless. Whispers returned, the kind that had haunted her youth and middle years. That Almina, ever resourceful, may have once again relied on her charms and her connections to survive. Rumors of affairs resurfaced. This time not as scandalous indulgences but as desperate liaisons meant to secure money or favor. Whether true or not, the gossip spread like fire, feeding society's appetite for the downfall of a woman they had once envied. Even her children could not shield her. Her son, Henry, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, inherited the title and the remains of the estate, but he was in no position to rescue her from her ruin. Almina's relationship with her family grew strained as her struggles intensified. For a woman who had spent her life commanding attention, she now seemed increasingly isolated, abandoned to the consequences of her choices. Still, Almina was nothing if not a survivor. She fought back in every way she could. She moved from Highclere into smaller residences, selling one after another as her financial situation worsened. She negotiated, she schemed, she charmed, always trying to stay one step ahead of total collapse. But the tide was against her. By the late 1920s and into the 1930s, she was a shadow of the woman who had once hosted glittering dinners and commanded armies of servants. The contrast was almost theatrical. Once she had been a young bride, glittering in jewels, standing proudly beside the Earl in the great halls of Highclere. Now she was a widow pawning those same jewels. Her name whispered not with admiration, but with pity and contempt. The transformation from countess to debtor was complete, and it was brutal. Her enemies, both real and imagined, relished her fall. Newspapers that had once praised her wartime heroism now reported gleefully on her financial woes. Every legal battle was splashed across the press. Every sale of property was a headline. To the public, the Countess of Carnarvon had become a cautionary tale. Proof that wealth and privilege were no guarantee against ruin. And yet, Almina's story was not simply one of money lost. It was one of secrets exposed. With her fortune gone, the gossip that had long swirled around her gained new traction. Her affairs, her rumored abortions, her extravagances, all were revisited in the harsh light of her decline. For decades she had lived a double life, the dutiful Countess and the reckless Scandal. Now, in her fall, the darker side seemed to dominate. Society remembered her less as the angel of Highclere, and more as the woman who had wasted fortune, reputation, and love. Still, Almina clung to her pride. Even in reduced circumstances, she carried herself with the remnants of aristocratic dignity. Those who met her in her later years spoke of a woman who, despite her ruin, never entirely surrendered to shame. She had built her life on survival, and even now, stripped of wealth and status, she continued to endure. But the toll was undeniable. The glamorous parties, the lavish hospitals, the golden days of Egypt, those were gone. What remained was a woman aged beyond her years, her health declining, her reputation in tatters, her fortune spent. And yet, perhaps most tragically, Almina was still not finished with scandal. Her final years would be as shadowed as her youth, filled with whispers of loneliness, poverty, and whispered tales about the strange circumstances of her death. The twilight of Lady Almina Carnarvon's life was a far cry from the dazzling beginnings that had once made her the toast of Edwardian society, the illegitimate daughter who had risen to become Countess of Carnarvon, the glittering hostess of Highclere, the wartime savior of wounded soldiers, and the widow of the man linked forever to Tutankhamun's tomb. By the end, all of it had slipped away. What remained was a woman alone, embattled by debts, haunted by scandal, and increasingly forgotten by the very world she had once enthralled. After Lord Carnarvon's death in 1923, Almina's descent had been steady but relentless. The once limitless Rothschild fortune that had underpinned her life was gone. Highclere Castle, the stage of her triumphs and her scandals, was no longer her domain. Her son, Henry, the 6th Earl, inherited the estate and quickly distanced himself from his mother's financial chaos. The glittering rooms where Almina had once presided as queen of the aristocracy became places she visited only occasionally, no longer her empire to command. In her later years, Almina moved through a series of smaller houses and apartments, each less grand than the last. She sold her jewels, her gowns, and the heirlooms that once symbolized her place in the world. The newspapers, always eager to exploit a fallen aristocrat, reported her financial struggles with cruel glee. She became, in the eyes of many, a tragic curiosity, the countess who had squandered her fortune, her dignity, and her place in history. But beyond the financial ruin lay the more corrosive poison of gossip. The rumors that had haunted her youth and middle years returned in force as her fortunes waned. Whispers of affairs, of illegitimate children, of abortions hidden in secrecy, all were resurrected by a society eager to watch a fallen woman burn. In the glittering heyday of Highclere, Almina had wielded men only as both shield and weapon. Now without it, she was defenseless. Every whisper grew louder, every accusation harder to silence. Her reputation suffered another cruel twist as the decades wore on. To the younger generation, she was not remembered as the dazzling hostess or the wartime benefactor, but as a relic of scandal. While Highclere Castle found new life as a symbol of aristocratic endurance, decades later becoming known worldwide as the setting of Downton Abbey, Almina's name was more often linked to disgrace than glory. She was the fallen countess, the woman whose life had been marked as much by whispered sins as by public triumphs. Her health too began to fail. Years of stress, financial strain, and emotional isolation took their toll. Once famed for her beauty and vitality, she aged quickly, her face etched with the struggles she could not conceal. Friends drifted away. Her family kept their distance. The lively parties and glittering balls were replaced by silence, by the slow passage of days in obscurity. And yet, even in her decline, Almina remained a figure of fascination. There were those who visited her, curious to see what had become of the woman who had once been at the center of everything. They found not a broken beggar, but a proud, imperious figure who carried herself with the remnants of aristocratic poise. She had lost everything, but she refused to bow to pity. In this, perhaps, lay her greatest act of defiance. Her death, like much of her life, was surrounded by whispers. Accounts differ on her final days, with some claiming she passed quietly, others suggesting that scandal followed her even into the grave. What is known is that in 1969, Lady Almina Carnarvon died, aged 89. She had lived long enough to see the world that once adored her change beyond recognition, long enough to outlast her scandals, but not long enough to her reputation. Her funeral was a quiet affair, far removed from the grandeur she had once commanded. There were no lavish ceremonies, no throngs of society figures paying homage. She slipped into history quietly, almost as though the world wished to forget her, and yet her story lingered, half tragedy, half cautionary tale, entirely unforgettable. To some, she was a heroine who gave her fortune to save the lives of soldiers, who opened her home in the service of her country. To others, she was the reckless countess who squandered her wealth, betrayed her vows, and lived a life of scandal and contradiction. In truth, she was both. Lady Almina Carnarvon was a woman of extremes, capable of extraordinary generosity and reckless indulgence, of angelic compassion and shocking secrecy. Her legacy is one of paradox. She was celebrated, condemned, admired, and despised, all in equal measure. Even in death, her story refused to settle neatly into one narrative. Instead, it remains as complicated and contradictory as the woman herself. As the last chapter of her life closed, society was left to wonder. Had Lady Almina been a victim of her times, trapped by the suffocating expectations of wealth, gender, and class? Or had she been the architect of her own downfall, a woman whose choices, driven by desire, desperation, and pride, had led her inevitably to ruin? Whatever the answer, one truth remained undeniable. Behind the golden walls of Highclere Castle, behind the jewels, the scandals, and the whispered sins, Lady Almina Carnarvon had lived a life that could never be forgotten. The story of Lady Almina Carnarvon does not end with her death in 1969. In truth, it never truly ended at all. Her life, filled with dazzling triumphs, whispered scandals, and staggering contradictions, left an imprint that still lingers in the shadows of Highclere Castle and in the pages of history. If her final years were spent in obscurity, her legacy has endured, twisted and refracted through the twin lenses of scandal and fascination. Highclere Castle itself, the stage upon which so much of her drama had unfolded, became the ultimate survivor. Where Almina lost her fortune, her dignity, and finally her life, the castle endured. Her son, Henry, the 6th Earl of Carnarvon, had long since distanced himself from his mother's reckless spending and public humiliations, but in doing so, he preserved the estate. While Lady Almina was fading from the limelight, Highclere remained an enduring symbol of aristocratic grandeur, its limestone walls holding secrets too scandalous to ever fully vanish. In the decades that followed, the castle would experience its own struggles, teetering at times on the brink of collapse as so many country houses did in the mid-20th century. But unlike Almina herself, Highclere reinvented itself. The most dramatic twist of all came in the 21st century, when the world came to know it not as the residence of the scandal-ridden Lady Almina, but as the beloved backdrop of Downton Abbey. Millions who watched the series fell in love with the estate, unaware that its real history had been shaped by a woman whose scandals could outmatch anything scripted for television. And yet, beneath the glossy image presented to modern audiences, Almina's spirit lingers. She was the woman who had brought Rothschild millions into the Carnarvon line, who had saved Highclere during her lifetime with her wealth, and who had given it purpose during World War I when she transformed it into a hospital. Without her, the castle may not have survived long enough to become a cultural icon in the modern age. Her legacy is as much brick and stone as it is whispers and shadows, but her name is not remembered simply for philanthropy or hospitality. More often, it is the scandals that surface when her story is retold. Historians, biographers, and journalists have returned time and again to the salacious tales of her affairs, her rumored abortions, her reckless spending, and her fall from grace. She remains a figure who resists sanitization, too flawed to be revered, too fascinating to be ignored. Even sympathetic accounts struggle to reconcile the contradictions. The angel of mercy in wartime and the woman who squandered millions, the dutiful countess and the adulteress, the generous benefactor and the reckless spendthrift. This duality is what makes her legacy so enduring. She embodies the contradictions of her age, the rigid expectations of aristocracy colliding with the private desires and public failures of a woman unwilling or unable to conform. In many ways, Lady Almina is less a cautionary tale and more a mirror held up to the hypocrisies of her society. She was celebrated when her wealth served others, condemned when her personal life broke the rules, and discarded when her money was gone. Her association with the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb only deepens the aura of mystery. Lord Carnarvon's death, often linked to the so-called curse of the pharaohs, left Almina both enriched and tainted. She inherited his fortune at a crucial moment, yet the shadow of that expedition and the myths surrounding it only added to the sense that scandal followed her at every turn. Some even whispered that her later misfortunes were the curse at work, exacting a price far greater than anyone expected. In her later obscurity, Lady Almina became almost ghost-like, an aristocrat stripped of her empire, a scandal kept alive by whispers, and yet, in recent decades, her life has been re-examined not only as a series of missteps, but as the story of a woman who, in her own flawed way, left a profound mark. Without her wealth, Highclere might never have survived into the modern age. Without her hospital, countless soldiers might have suffered or died. Without her extravagance, society would not have been gifted the tale of a woman whose rise and fall feels as dramatic as any tragedy penned for the stage. Today, when visitors wander through the grand halls of Highclere, they see portraits of ancestors, glittering rooms, and the curated beauty of aristocratic life. Yet, somewhere in those halls, the shadow of Almina lingers. It lingers in the hospital rooms she once filled with broken soldiers. It lingers in the scandalous whispers of love affairs that scandalized her peers. It lingers in the financial ruin that nearly destroyed the Carnarvon name. Her story has become part of the myth of Highclere, half celebrated, half buried, never fully told. The world remembers her not as one thing, but as many: the glittering, illegitimate heiress, the scandalous countess, the wartime angel, the woman who fell from grace, and the ghost who haunts the castle even today. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of Lady Almina Carnarvon. Not her fortune, not her scandals, not even her hospital or her connection to Tutankhamun. Her legacy is the fact that she cannot be forgotten. No matter how hard society tried to bury her beneath gossip or erase her through silence, her story continues to resurface, to demand attention, to challenge the narratives we prefer to believe about history's aristocratic women. Lady Almina's life remains a riddle of wealth and ruin, compassion and betrayal, secrecy and exposure. In her, we see the eternal fascination of scandal and the enduring tragedy of secrets that refuse to stay buried. For in the end, Lady Almina Carnarvon lived a life that was itself a curse and a legacy, a life too dark to be erased, too glittering to be ignored, and too human to be anything but unforgettable.